to A Fresh Face in Hell. I'm your host, Jonathan Evison. Every week we talk to someone new and interesting, somebody intellectually curious, somebody who will hopefully renew our faith in this cold, cruel world we live in. A Fresh Face in Hell. So today we're going to talk about dreams, specifically dreams of being an artist. We're going to talk about the life of an artist. We're going to talk to Chris Wilcha, the Emmy Award-winning director of Flipside, which you can find streaming on Criterion, Amazon, and elsewhere, or if you just happen to be on a Delta flight. I cannot recommend this film highly enough. Fans of Errol Morris will especially love it. Such a great reflection on what it means to be an artist and struggle with the work, with making money, with self-confidence. Do check out Flipside. It's really great. I kept thinking as I watched Flipside of my late brother Davey, the lounge singer, who ended his life feeling like he was a failure. He was a lounge musician, as I said, and he felt like a failure because he never made it in the conventional commercial sense. But he was such a huge inspiration to me because he kept soldiering on in service of the work, because that's the thing that really matters in all of this, is the art, the work itself. And Flipside is a brilliant exploration of the value of living an artistic life. So please welcome to the show, Chris Wilcha. So, Chris, thanks for being our fresh face in hell this week.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, where to begin? There is so much I love about this film. I found it so relatable on so many levels. The personal struggles, yours as an artist, that awkward dance between art and commerce, measuring what you'd refer to in the film, or I think maybe it's Lynch that, or David Milch that refers to it as the value of an artistic life. To me, I think there's an intrinsic value in just the dream itself, whatever comes from it. There's value in the struggle of making the art. I just turned in a novel about my late brother who took his own life 5 years ago, Davey, and he was a lounge musician in the 70s and 80s. So he sung the Great American Songbook, one-man band. He played the Rhodes with his left hand, key bass with the right. He had a little rhythm maker, and he was, playing in like logging bars, because that's what we have in the Northwest, and not getting a lot of traction. And 40 years after the great heyday of the Great American Songbook, so it wasn't exactly very topical at the time, but he never understood why he was my idol. He was 16 years older, and he never understood that he was my hero. And he's like, "What do you mean? I've never made it. I'm a bum." And that's exactly why he was my idol, because he just kept forging on in service of the art itself, because that's, to me, where the real value is. Now, after this whole journey you've had, would you agree that the value is truly in the work itself? Has that been your experience?
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about your brother. And that actually sounds like an incredible opportunity to reflect on all these similar ideas, right? What a poignant story. So I look forward to reading that. I do think I agree with you. Yes, that it is in the doing. I think that I am addicted to creative work, to the problem solving of it, to the chasing of the possibility of making something that might connect with another person, to trying to take an abstract idea that's in your mind or in the ether and wrestle it to the ground and make it into something, be it a story or a photo. And I still derive a ton of meaning out of that. And it's not even something I have to think that much about doing. It's just this inherent thing, to grab a camera or to start talking or interviewing someone. So I find a ton of meaning in doing that. I think what's interesting and where things get a little complicated is when it's entwined with making a living.
Exactly.
Right.
See, that's the thing about the film that made me think of my brother, is that throughout the film, you sort of struggle with this other measure of success, which is, and we'll talk about that, because, you had a really good model with your dad of like somebody who did something that's, sort of creative, but that was the end for him. It wasn't like, and it endeared you. It made you very endurable and relatable, but like it was this, it kind of got you into trouble too, sort of measuring yourself by like, material success or whatever.
Yeah. Did your brother have, like, day jobs, or was his only pursuit that gig?
He had a
The
pretty spotty work history. His
Yeah.
girlfriends wish he had a day job, but, like, he was totally fully on committed. I mean, he worked at UPS for a number of years, but God, like, the last 20 years of it, like, no, he just went, he just get a one-off now and then. Once in a while, he'd book a place. So, yeah, he was not. I don't, and that's why I think he died feeling like a failure, and that's what I wish I could have told him, is that, no, because to me, the success was that you did it for the right reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
I mean, this is an endless and ongoing conversation in my own personal life and in my friends' lives, which is, again, how to walk this crazy tightrope of living in, this hyper capitalist society, wanting to make things that maybe don't have a totally obvious outlet, or making things, is there an opportunity to actually be compensated in some way that can help you make more things, right? And I just think that that is so navigating that is so hard, and I think things have gotten actually so much worse, right? So even Flipside, which I made, with the help of just a group of friends, and we put in, it was all kind of sweat equity, and people I've worked with for a long time, we all put in a little bit of our own money to make it, and putting it in the world, it is so devalued, you know what I mean? Like, it's not a thing. Like, for instance, so the other day, I noticed that Flipside was on, it said, "It's available to stream," right? And it's that deal where you can rent it for, like, $4 and you can buy it for, like, $8 or whatever. And then I saw one day that it was available with Amazon Prime, and I wrote to the distributor and I said, "Hey, how does that work? Do they just, like, keep a tab and they just pay me for how many views happen?" And I got back this paragraph-long email that basically explained that there's a proprietary algorithm that measures engagement, and that engagement means how many times a person stopped or started, or where they, how long they watched, but that this algorithm calculates how much I will get, and I stand to make .1 cent per hour of engagement. And I just wrote back and I said, "Are you fucking serious?" And they said, "Now you know how musicians feel. This is the Spotifyification or
Right,
whatever of."
700,000 downloads to make
Yeah,
$1,000 or
yeah,
something.
and I just had this moment of just, like, you sort of realize that I just think what's hard is when everything is a labor of love. You know what I mean? Like, how do you then make a living? And again, you figure ways to do it. You figure out ways to do it. And I think in my life, the path was commercial work, right? That was something I did, commercial directing work. I mean, in your world, it would have been, in writing, it would have been something, copywriting or whatever,
Well,
or
I
advertising. Yeah,
did a bit of that
yeah,
with
yeah, yeah.
Jason, my producer. I mean, that's his.
The thing that's interesting about commercial directing, which again has amazing benefits, and you definitely get to work with incredibly talented people and equipment you would never have access to, because sometimes but the problem is that whole uh industry is in a state of abject decline, as I'm sure you're aware. So that is now disappearing. And then I heard you talking on a recent episode about AI, and that is pretty much the death knell, I think, for a lot of this ad stuff. I mean, I just read about,
And one
the
Swedish guy with a laptop, there goes your whole production crew,
it
basically, yeah.
it's gone. I mean, there was something I read the other day where it said that Facebook's model is now the company comes to Facebook and says, "We want to advertise." They generate the ad with AI, the imagery, the copy, and then they endlessly iterate on it. So they target people, they put it out, and then they can tweak it, change the photo, change the copy, and they can just keep doing that open-endedly until they find the perfect sweet spot. And it's like so that whole closed pipeline, I think about all the jobs that used to involve, right? Makeup artists and transpo people and DPs and grips and gaffers and producers. And, that is a wild thing to consider, that in this, the blink of an eye, an entire industry is sort of eviscerated. So anyway, we don't have to go
It's
down the
like
AI
logging
rabbit
in the
hole.
19th century. When steam came to the forest, you used to have, like, 40 Jippo logging crews of, like, 30, 40 guys each, and all of a sudden, they bring in a steam donkey, and it's like, boom, the entire workforce disappeared overnight. I'm gonna dive into before I don't wanna you look like you're getting depressed talking
No,
about this.
no, no, I don't
I
mean to
sell
be.
books for a living, so I highly relate. Like I'm trying to figure out how many books I actually sell for how many people read it because I always got ladies like emailing me saying, "Hey, I'm 125th on the library rating list," and I'm like, "Oh, geez, thanks. You want me to send you 15 bucks? Why are you telling me this?" And then like, "Oh, I got your book. I loved it so much. I gave it to my sister, and she gave it to her brother." And then people buy it used, and it's like for every book I sell retail, I swear to God, 20 people actually consume the book. Somehow I make it. I don't know how. The story of Flipside is like it's almost impossible to tell people. It's really if Errol Morris is like a really great comp for this because the disappearance of the fourth wall and how it becomes about your journey and how you tie together all these other threads of unfinished projects. But the real entree into the story is Dan, the owner of Flipside Records, whom you this is kind of where your artistic life sort of began. I think you picked up a camera before that, but this is where you kind of found your tribe. So this is where the film starts. Kind of tell us about that.
Yeah.
Teenager in New Jersey.
And I'm sure you had some version of this. I feel like a lot of people I talk to have some origin story of like the place where, a certain passion or interest was sparked. But I was a music obsessed teenager and, used to living in the suburbs of northern New Jersey. I would sneak into the city and, go to Tower Records and Bleecker Street and, all do these record buying missions. And there was a record store in a town, two towns over called Flipside. And I went and, made the case to work for this guy, and I was his very first employee. It was just a total fluke that I happened to walk through the door, and he was starting to realize that he needed some help. So I'm some wide-eyed 16-year-old, and again, imagine, again, walking into this archive. His personal collection of records were there, so I could just play those all day long, and then all of these records were in the store that I could play because it was new and used. And then, he had, like, a sketchy guy who would come in and sell bootlegs, and I could just listen to those. That was a whole phenomena of the, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? The bootleg. Remember that of like,
Oh
the
God, I lived
the
upstairs from some Deadheads, dude, and like are
yes.
the only music they ever played, and they all sound the same. That shitty recording outside, and it's like they're like, "Oh, dude, Red Rock '73, man. Listen to this version of
Yeah, yeah,
Saint
yeah,
Stephen."
yeah. But I remember there was a whole strain of even like, I just found the other day, I actually bought some, like, Jane's Addiction bootlegs. It was, like, live shows from some tour in 1987 or something or '88, and it was like anyway, it was like this license to just educate myself endlessly and open-endedly, and then, and again, I feel like I'm starting to sound like, the Gen X nostalgia of it all, but the record store itself was a hub, right? So all these people came and hung out there. People would stop by on the weekends. People would just hang out and want to play records and listen and talk. And so it was kind of, that pre-internet in real life kind of clubhouse. Um, and the other thing about where it was is it was close enough to New York City that every once in a while, interesting people would pass through the doors, micro celebrities. I remember members of the Feelies would pop in, and I was to me at the time, this was like,
Real
these were
millions.
celebrities. Yeah. I mean, I'd just seen them on, Jonathan Demme's, movie, and here they are in the store shopping. And then one person who passed through, which again was like a celebrity to me, was this guy, Uncle Floyd, who had this cable access show in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And he was just kind of this iconic character, and he would come shop for records. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the record store it was an incredible place to work, and I often didn't get paid. I would at the end of the day, I would just leave with records because I just, I was it was one of those jobs that taught me that the best kind of work is when you don't even feel the passage of time. I had jobs before that. Like I was like a caddy at a golf course and I worked at a bakery. And these were all the kinds of jobs where you're miserable and dreading it. This was a place that I, could not have been happier to spend time at. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you met your through this you met your tribe, and as years went on and your artistic journey kind of goes on for here, I don't want to spoil the film, and it's really hard to encapsulate. I mean, that's what's so brilliant about it is that
Thank you.
it just sort of unfolds very organically, which is, as somebody who's written novels with many divergent points of view and stuff, I know it is not easy to put that tapestry together and have your themes gel all at the right time and everything. But years later, you come up with the conceit of trying to help Dan, the owner, save Flipside, which has hit hard times. And I got to say, first of all, my introduction, we see some older pictures of the place when it's a little more, let's just call it sparsely decorated or whatever. But like when we're introduced to Dano, and I'm an avid record collector myself, I've got like 5,000 records out across all genres, all eras. Just my garage is full of vinyl. I go to record stores coast to coast. I know Dan. Okay. I know him a million times. And he characterizes himself at this point aptly at the time of the film as an archivist, but I kind of almost feel like hoarder might be apropos. So you've told us our Genesis story about Dan, but when you came to save the place by making the film, that was the conceit of the project. I was kind of thinking, well, why didn't you just give him some retail tips? Like, dude, vacuum your carpet, take some of the meat boxes crack me up because everyone's like, "Yeah, man, the place always smells like beef jerky or whatever," and it's because he's storing all the records in these meat boxes from the butcher next door. I mean, I'm just thinking, Dan, why didn't you take him aside and say, "Look," or Chris, just say, "Dan, you know, all those boxes in the aisle, people got to have a little room to walk. You know, maybe let's get rid of those water stains on the ceiling." You almost sort of like clearly you could see that, right?
Yeah. I started to try to engage with him about basic things that could improve the flip side experience. And one, it's funny, I was just doing some DVD extras. We're actually doing a flip side DVD, speaking of nostalgia for old media. But I was putting on some deleted scenes or whatever, things that didn't make it in. And there's a scene that we shot where Dan briefly, his brother-in-law had lent him a computer. It was like a decrepit old PC. And for like a minute and a half, he was going to try to have a website. And we shot this scene where it takes 20 minutes for this PC to boot up and for him to call up the website and figure. And it was completely clear to me that he was done with learning new things. He did not want to engage with social media. He thought Facebook was a plot to steal all of our privacy, which, by the way, he had that kind of grizzled boomer anti-privacy thing, and he, of course, turned out to be completely right. Back in 2011 when I was talking to him, or 2013, I was like, "Oh, you should get on Facebook," and, it's this, and he was not interested.
So, by the way, my brother was the same way. I'd go, "You should get a Facebook page. So every time the restaurant you're playing at closes, you can regather your tribe, right?"
Yeah.
So they didn't have to reinvent the wheel and build a new
Oof.
audience but he wouldn't do it. He didn't, I mean,
Yeah.
it's tough. I mean,
It's
I don't want
tough.
to grow either, but you just kind of
So, Dan, I think, was not so the thing is if you're gonna take on the challenge of doing something new, you have to kinda, like, throw yourself into it, right? And he had no interest. Like, you can't argue somebody into getting excited about posting on Instagram and understanding the sort of benefits. I think for him, it just all felt like a distraction, or it was overwhelming, or maybe it made him feel stupid, but he just wasn't interested. Um, Now, you bring up another issue, which is the store. Part of its mad charm is also the thing that turns off a lot of people, which is it is filthy. It is stacks upon stacks of stuff. You have to pull things to even get the records out of the things they're in. You have to pull out other records. Like, it's a completely hostile retail experience, but yet the person who is game to roll up their sleeves and literally get their hands dirty is rewarded, right? Like, there's an analog discovery. You don't go in there to find something you want. You go in there to have your mind blown by something you didn't know existed. You know what I mean? And I think that that was a
completely, that's
huge.
key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think what I started to realize at a certain point was that, oh, this is actually an experience that is worth preserving, and not and just like, I accepted at a certain point that, like, even his friend, he has a friend, and this is, I described this in the movie, who decided to sort of take on the task of putting him on Instagram. But the problem is that takes a lot of work. You gotta post every day, and his friend has another full-time job and has a whole life outside of, this. So there's no that upkeep, that cultivation, that building a business thing. I just think he could never wrap his head around it. So,
And also, with social networks, you really do gotta kinda bring something to the party. Like, publicists are always telling writers, "You gotta have a Facebook page," but the fact is the reason it's been successful for me is because I actually like it. I mean, I like the interface. I like gathering my people
Yeah.
far and wide into one place. But if you don't approach it that way, you're not bringing anything to the party. It's just gonna kind of sit there
No,
anyway.
exactly, it's gonna die. What's
And so
your
meanwhile,
oh,
what's that?
sorry. No, I was gonna
No,
say,
no,
what's
go.
your social media, your favorite? Is Insta
Facebook, which,
Facebook? So
total dinosaur here. I mean, it has limits to its growth. Like, I don't like Instagram. I like Facebook for its intimacy. I like that. I mean, of course, I hate all the privacy stuff and the Zuckerberg stuff and the politics, but like, I've got guys, there's like 12 guys I played Little League with in there, people I went to kindergarten with, people from every single job I ever had, people from every band I was in, people from all the punk shows, people, all my writer friends, all my reader friends, all my high school alumni. And like, there's no way I can get all those people all in one place. So to me, it's kind of beautiful for that. But like, I'm really lazy. Jason will tell you about Instagram and like TikTok, forget about it. I'm not even gonna. So, I mean, it's really easy for me to relate to Dan in that way. But what puts a fine point on Dan's failure to do so is because this other record store opens sort of just down the street.
yeah. Yeah, so unbelievably, I was going back and forth to New Jersey during this window of time, and I feel like I'm not you tell me how much context I should provide for the listener who probably hasn't seen it. But, part of the story is I go back to this record store that I worked at in high school, and I periodically visit and film there, and I'm trying to help him think about, maybe refreshing, trying to get it on social media, all that kind of stuff. And then out of no, and by the way, this is a small town in New Jersey called Pompton Lakes. A lot of the storefronts along this main drag are actually shuttered. There's no businesses in them. And the idea that Dan has kept Flipside open is remarkable. And then out of nowhere, around the corner, magically one day, another record store appears. And this guy, and he's very nice. And by the way, also, mildly amusing, his name is also Dan. So there's 2 record stores with 2 owned by 2 guys named Dan, and he knew Dan, or Station 1 Dan, that's the name of his store. He's on Instagram every day. He's refreshing his stock. He advertises for records for people to bring their stuff to him to buy, books and records. Whereas Dan now, his model is just waiting for people to come by with a cart full of records. And I think that's happening less and less. The people who would have done that 10 years ago are maybe so old now or have given everything away. Whereas the other Dan is out on this endless scavenger hunt for collections. And, social media is a very easy way to do that. Dan doesn't have a functioning credit card machine at the moment, whereas Dan at Station 1 does. So the comparison between the 2 stores is kind of funny and absurd, but it's also a snapshot of these 2 totally different ways of running a small business.
And it's painful to, I mean, because I think even maybe what Dan doesn't seem to realize is that it's not the store, it's Dan that's the resource. Because like, as a guy who goes to record stores, I would walk in there and I'm like, I would be overwhelmed immediately because I am looking for certain things. I mean, I love finding stuff in the wild too, but I am looking for things. And so if Dan wasn't there, I'd be totally lost. So like, when I go to a store like that, and I've been to it, and I'm like, okay, order. And I go to the desk and I go, I know that this guy, just by
Yeah.
nature, probably has 50,000 other records, but he knows exactly, if I'm going, hey, I want a first pressing of that Spooky Tooth record from 1971, he's going to know exactly where to go. Whereas I could be in there for 3 weeks and I'd never find it. So, and I didn't get the sense that he was, maybe at some point he was out there more when you were back there and a teenager, but at this point it seemed like, as a personality, he had sort of receded a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
maybe not
That's
out in front as much. Can I help you find something? Because you need help navigating that place.
I think that's true. And I think it sort of broke my heart a little bit that he was a little bit less. He will help you, by the way. If you go there and you ask him the obscure question, I think that he will often, burrow in and he'll know that he has 3 copies of this and one is, a certain condition and all that kind of stuff. But I think you're picking up on something that is true, which is I do think he's getting older, and I think maybe he's the grind of going to that store every day, of the kind of repetition of the tasks. I think he maybe lost a little bit of his mojo. Now, I will say, and again, I feel bad for people who haven't seen it as we're talking about this, but when Flipside came out, I pretty immediately started to get texts or DMs from people I didn't even know who would say, "I made the pilgrimage and I dropped $300." You know, and I think that, and I owe Dan a call. We haven't talked in a few months, but I think that there has been a fun And I'm not saying like overwhelming, and it's not like it went viral in some insane way and it's reinvented his life, but I do think people are going there having seen the documentary and they wanna engage with him and they wanna dig through the crates and stuff, and I think that's been a nice consequence of having made the documentary.
And okay, so now before everyone thinks that this documentary is just about Flipside, because it's really about Chris Wilcha at the end of the day, you set out to make this, the conceit of making and trying to help Flipside survive, but you never finished the documentary, and this is kind of Achilles' heel for you at this point. So tell us about. I mean, you're one of these people that obsessively shoots, gets these ideas and starts this, and this is a continuing theme. We see it with Starley a little bit too. Somebody who just doesn't, for whatever reason, it just doesn't go to that next level.
Yeah.
So, which makes this film so triumphant because so many of these things you start come back and you get to, and it's wonderful. But like, talk a little bit about what happened in that process for you as an artist, where you would start something, maybe it looks different every time, but why didn't you finish all these other documentaries? Why didn't the first one? I know life gets in the way, but you tell me,
Yeah.
in some of these other documentaries that you made, why couldn't you finish them?
Yeah. Well, again, to I'm conscious of this person who hasn't seen the movie, so I'll just say quickly, Flipside is not only about this record store, but it's about revisiting these unfinished documentary projects that I would start for various reasons or start and stop for different reasons, right? And it tries to sort of use all these disparate puzzle pieces to tell a story about, I don't know, creativity and trying to live a creative life, right? So that's a terrible pitch, but so the individual
Not to
projects.
our listeners, no, I mean, that's no, I think that's you did a good job.
Yeah, thank you. So I have had the experience of running around trying to pitch things, and sometimes it can be torture of writing the treatment and making you find that you're spending all of your time on the sales materials and not making the thing. And I definitely have the instinct often to just go out and make it. And it's probably part of that like DIY, zine punk rock thing from back in the day, but like that you just kind of pick up a camera and go. And so I would often, and I continue to, start documentary projects. There would be a person or a subject or an event or a band or this or that, and I would just start shooting. And I wouldn't necessarily have a defined purpose or a financing, um, but I would often just act on those instincts. And what happens is there are a whole host of reasons, and I think a lot of people can identify with this, where sometimes you lose your access. Sometimes you lose your creative will. You just don't believe in the project. Maybe it should be a short and not a feature length doc. There are other things where a person, in documentary, it's not like just writing a novel on your shoulders. You need the engagement of these other people. They may lose interest, right? So I went and during the pandemic, like a lot of us, I was sort of sifting through various old hard drives and stuff, and I, was revisiting these old projects that I had not taken to completion for one reason or another. And as I started to look at them and I sort of realized that there was still meaning in a lot of them, that they still held the possibility of revisiting. And so part of the fabric of Flipside are these unfinished projects, and we sort of break them into different pieces, and they recur. Characters recur, and it becomes made up of all of these unfinished projects. Does that make sense?
Yes, and we're gonna I intend to go kinda through. We've talked about Dan because he's sort of our first window into this, but we're gonna talk about Herman Leonard, we're gonna talk about Starley, we're gonna talk about how they all come together, but you did have sort of an auspicious beginning to your documentarian career, the Target shoots first. Tell us about that, and tell us about the irony beginning with your sort of, working for the Columbia Record Club and, like, how that's turned
Yeah,
around and your dad, and this is a big part of the film too.
yeah. Um, well, I, like a lot of college grads, needed a job, and I had these aspirations of living in New York City, and this was sort of the early '90s, and you could still kinda live a bohemian life in the city itself. You could still have a bunch of roommates and live on the island of Manhattan. And, I was applying for a bunch of jobs, and I didn't have a lot of qualifications, and I ended up getting a job at the Columbia House CD and Tape Club, which many people remember for, 8 CDs, 11 CDs for a penny, and it was all pre-internet. This was a catalog would be mailed to you, and you could, um, get all this music in bulk, and then they had a kind of elaborate mail order scheme where they would, like, mail you things that you didn't ask for, and then you'd have to send it back and they'd charge you. And it was a whole convoluted model.
I had collections after me for like
Yeah.
4 years
Yeah. And
because we
many
all bite,
people,
"Oh, 12 records for a buck or whatever," and then
exactly, exactly. And many people tell stories, every time I see people who, oh, I signed up as Abe Lincoln or whatever, and, I scammed all these CDs. It was an unfortunate business model because I think there was a way to make it feel less scammy, but it was that era of like the scammy was somehow, um, I don't know, like tolerated in this creepy way. But anyway, that was my first job out of college, was working in the marketing department at this mail order CD and tape club. And what was interesting is it was not a cool job in the sense that I wasn't working at, Matador Records or, like it wasn't a cool place to work. It was a little bit more mainstream, a kind of backwater of the music industry. But this is at a time when there was so much money around, meaning, people were rebuying their entire CD collections at these outrageous price points. They were doing it, through Columbia House was helping them do this, right? That you all of a sudden wanted to replace all of your Bob Dylan and all of your, Willie Nelson records or whatever. You know what I mean? So you were rebuying your entire collection, and you were also doing it where the price point, they were making them for a buck and selling them for 17 bucks with supposed high fidelity, superiority or whatever. So I was working there, and I was also obsessed with documentary. I had not studied it in school or anything like that. I didn't go to film school, uh, but I was such a obsessed viewer and consumer of documentary films. And living in New York City at the time, you could go to Film Forum and see a whole, Frederick Wiseman retrospective for a week, or, there was just tons of places to see and consume all this kind of nonfiction stuff. So when I got this corporate job, I started bringing a video camera to work every day, which obviously now is not particularly novel, right? Everyone is documenting everything and posting everything. But back then, it was a little bit unusual to be carrying a camera around and documenting your life. And there was filmmakers that, had done this before, Ross McElwee and, obviously Errol had done some interesting stuff and others. But um, so I started bringing a camera to work every day, and I worked there for a couple of years, and I gathered all of this material, which it was sort of a corporate coming of age story. And it told the story of how, you know, the Columbia House wanted to figure out how to market to a younger demographic, which I was the demographic. They wanted to get in on this whole grunge thing, and they couldn't figure out how to do it. And I remember their graphic design, they'd have like a fence with like a spray paint font, and they thought like that's going to speak to the grunge kids, and like it was so tone deaf, right? And it was that
well,
classic moment.
that's what Columbia House was. I mean, and that's
Exactly.
why your dad was so proud of you. Like
He was
that
very
in your
proud.
dad's world, your dad, you can explain that your dad was in sort of
Ad
promotional,
adjacent, yeah,
yeah,
marketing, all
ad
that stuff.
adjacent marketing, and like that's what it was for him. It was some older guys in suits trying to speak the language of
Yeah.
the youth of today. And
Exactly, and at that moment, there was a very exaggerated divide where you could feel, the Gen Xers were so sensitive and so aware of when they were trying to be sold to, and
yes.
so I was promoted and given the task of speaking to this generation, which, you know, I was sort of aware of what was happening at the time, which is like, am I kind of selling out, my generation, by doing this? But it was an interesting exercise where I gathered a bunch of young friends. We sort of existed in a bubble within the company, and we created these magazines that had a voice, that had a sense of humor. This was nothing that Columbia House had ever experimented with before. And lo and behold, it was successful. And this happened to coincide with alternative music having a little bit of a post grunge heyday, right? So a lot of these bands were, uh, you know, there was a signing frenzy on all the major labels, and it was wild to watch, like the Melvins on Atlantic, like it all just was so kind of incongruous and funny, um and so
I got
we
the
made
Melvins their first show out of Seattle, or their first show out of Aberdeen. They had never played outside of Monty or Aberdeen, and I
that's
got them booked at
incredible.
the Graven Edge when I was 14. Yeah.
I would be fascinated to know because I haven't heard an interview with them in a minute, but like what they now think of that Atlantic era, like if they look back on it as like a funny aberration.
Oh, you know what Buzz is gonna say. He just never has a good word to say. I mean, Buzz would just rip Atlantic a new one.
I'm sure. But anyway, so just to finish the thought, and I feel like I'm going on too long here, ended up making a documentary about that experience, and it sort of told the story of this corporate coming of age, of getting a job and then being empowered within that job to sort of help sell records to my peers. You know what I mean? And it was kind of my first experience doing sort of like a first person documentary. I'd never made anything before. And lo and behold, it had a really nice run on the festival circuit and ended up on HBO. And this was like a great calling card. This was like an amazing first way to transition to a new thing, right? Which is instead of being a marketing guy, now maybe I had the chance that I could be a filmmaker.
And then that led to a second film.
Yeah, well, I started pitching things, and I remember I made a bunch of stuff. Like, someone at MTV had taken an interest in the Target Juice First, and I pitched a bunch of show ideas and promo ideas, and they let me make them. And I think this was probably a millennials version of Vice, which the beauty of MTV at the time was there was no borders. Like, they just let these 20-year-olds make shit and put it on air. You know what I mean? So I made a show, and my pitch was it was called the pilot episode was called The Social History of the Mosh Pit. And the idea is that through a subculture, you could tell, a larger story. So the social history of concert t-shirts, or the social history of, like, a small thing could reveal bigger things about pop culture. And that became a series, and they did a bunch of them, right? So, like, that was like a first gig where I was like, oh wow, I can maybe make a living kind of doing this. And then an amazing sort of breakthrough job I got was the radio show This American Life was trying to figure out if it wanted to make a TV version. And I got a gig to, I went in and did a whole song and dance and pitched them a bunch of ideas. And we had a tiny, minuscule amount of money from Showtime to make a pilot. And so we did, it actually wasn't even supposed to be a pilot. It was just supposed to be a little test tape. We ended up shooting an entire half-hour episode, and we got the green light to do that, and that was like a dream job. That was like the nonfiction, Mount Everest or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I felt like that was wow, like, working with them, learning from them, understanding how they tell stories and do what they do. I still am living off the fumes of that in terms of what I learned and, you know so, yeah, that was an incredible
And
experience.
it won Emmys, and it ran a year, and it was doing great. Didn't it feel, I mean, God, man, I would have wanted to throttle Ira Glass because he kind of, and you work with guys that pull the plug on shit. Ira Glass pulled the plug on the show, just like David Milch pulled the plug on Deadwood. And I'm still pissed at him for that
Yeah.
because I'm sorry. I just didn't like John from Cincinnati. It was okay. But like, I mean, I'm still to this day mad at David Milch, who I'm enamored with him. He's genius, but like, I'm so pissed that we never got to see that. And I always figured big HBO or whatever pulled the plug because it was too expensive to produce or something. And I found out he did it. Why do you keep working with these guys that undermine themselves? Because that the Ira Glass thing did great. You win awards, and then he decides to I don't want to do it. It's what, too much work or just what?
Well, I think his obsession at the time and their focus and their true love was making radio, was audio storytelling, right? And this was like, what year was this? It was like 2006, 7, 8, like in that zone. And it did last a couple of years. And so the TV show was just like a novelty to them. And the thing about making a TV show is it is so painful. You have to get a crew, you have to fly all these bodies to a place, you have to light things. When they make a radio story, they go with a microphone and a person and they interview people and they can be editing it on the flight home and they could have, you know, the economics of it, the intimacy of it, it's so different. And I think the whole TV thing was such a pain in the ass, and even working with TV editors was like another layer where they were distanced from the making, you know what I mean? So I think they had fun, and I think there's a bunch of episodes that everyone's really proud of, and it won some awards, like you said, which was really fun. But I think there came a point where they were like, "We want to just focus on the radio show." And by the way, this is pre-podcast boom. So I remember thinking like, wow, they're returning to this medium that felt very like, old and maybe loomingly obsolete. And lo and behold, audio becomes, the wave of the future. And all of a sudden, millions of dollars are sloshing around in the podcast economy. And they definitely,
I
saw
wish
some
some
of
of that
that.
would splash our way. Talk about monetizing art. I haven't figured that out yet. Was this before? Now you did the thing with Judd Apatow where you made the extras for, was it Funny People?
Yeah, Funny People,
Which is a
his
great
film.
movie. I'm a huge Judd Apatow fan, and he really came across as a really authentic and genuine dude. It made me really, really like him. Was that before or after the Ira Glass?
It was after. I mean, the
Okay.
reason I even talked to him was because he had seen This American Life, and he was like, "Hey, I like this. Let's work on something together." And he said, "I am about to go shoot a movie called Funny People. Why don't you come out? Maybe there's a documentary companion that we could make." And to be totally honest with you, I'll just tell you a quick story. The original intention was that I was going to make a documentary about Gary Shandling, who was alive at the time, because Gary was sort of an inspiration for some of the Funny People themes and, was a mentor of Judd's. And so I spent a number of weeks trying desperately to get Gary Shandling to agree to be the subject of a documentary. And I have to tell you, while he was totally disinterested in doing the documentary, he was incredibly nice to me, and he would invite me to meet with him, and we would talk and talk and talk endlessly and open-endedly, and he would write me these single-spaced emails that were like, letters to a young artist kinda thing where he would tell me to, believe in my work and my voice and that like, he was incredibly generous, but it became very clear at a certain point that he had 0 interest in letting me film him, and so we had to redirect our energy, and I said to Judd, like, "What should I do?" And he said, "Let's focus on the movie I'm making," and we ended up making sort of the story, the Funny People Diaries, it was called, and it was the story of making that film.
And this is a kind of a big change in your life because you moved your family out there and you thought this is it. You thought this was like kind of you were taking it to the next level
The
because
big
you'd
time.
already yeah, and so this is another big part of your story. This is kind of like the second act here, right?
Yeah, I think professionally, I was like, "Wow, moving to LA, working for Judd Apatow." Like, I remember the first day I was driving to meet him on a studio lot, and I remember I saw driving down Venice Boulevard, they were putting up a billboard for Pineapple Express, which had dropped that week and was like, doing bananas box office, and I get to the lot and they're doing a reading and it's, Seth Rogen and Jason Schwartzman. I'm like, fuck, this is wow. Like it almost was like a door had opened, a portal into this whole alternate universe of like LA and celebrity culture and like, this Barton Fink journey to the West to, you know, um, and I think I made something for him that was completely respectable and he was totally happy with, but it was ultimately a making of. It aired once on Comedy Central, and now it's a DVD extra. That's the only way to see it on, the Funny People, like, Blu-ray. So, it was not like this breakthrough, like, moment, and I think, again, a lot of creative people, I think, have this experience, right? Which is it doesn't necessarily mean that overnight your life is gonna change, and you kinda have to stay on the grind, and you have to stay focused. I also think that I had a little bit of that Gen X nausea about the self-promotion part of it. I remember somebody when I got to LA was like, "You should be dining out on this. You should be telling every agent you are working for Judd Apatow and me," and, like, using his name, right? And that was, like, a very cringy thing to me, and I think another
Yeah,
person
trading on
might have
people's names is
it
we've
creeps me out still to this day, and I think that I found it very difficult to monetize that experience in any other way. Now, I will say, to take a longer term view, because that was 10 plus years ago, Judd actually has weirdly stayed in my life, and he ended up executive producing Flipside. He actually gave us some money to finish it. I'm actually collaborating with him on something now. So, like, that was a long-term bet that I placed of coming out here and working with him, and it has proven to have gifts that have played out over a longer chronology. It wasn't an overnight thing, but I still feel very lucky to have gotten to know him and the fact that he's been involved in any part of my sort of creative existence, you know?
yeah, well, you've been fortunate in many ways. I mean, like the David Milch thing too. Like you've written Ira Glass. I mean, it's a. I mean, you've worked with some amazing people. And speaking of David Milch, because he ties into this, I wanted to sort of touch on some of the other characters in the besides Dan, people who are trying to, people who are artists who are having difficulties of one form, and that Herman Leonard. So I have this big detached garage out in the woods at my cabin, and it's like 700 square feet, and it's basically just like a dive bar in Elks Hall, and it's just covered with old punk flyers and Rainier beer posters and all my musical idols. And so many of those I now realize in watching the film because I just kind of pirated them. Like I like this picture I found, and I go to the printer and so many of them I recognized watching your film were Herman Leonard photographs, like that Dexter Gordon, the Billie Holiday, the Django Reinhardt, the Count Basie. I mean, I have probably 15. His work is so well represented, more than any other photographer, even more than my friend Charles Peterson, who took all the grunge. Herman Leonard is all over my garage.
Do you own some
Um,
Charles Petersons too?
what's that?
You own some Charles
I
Petersons
don't
too?
think, well, not, yeah, and some Lance Mercers as well, like who's another. We're going to have Charles on the podcast here, hopefully in a couple weeks. But tell us about how you ended up filming Herman. Herman is like what, he's in his 80s and he was
Yeah.
dying, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, for those who don't know, Herman is a photographer who made these images that, again, they're almost like your memory of jazz. Like, you know what I mean? We've all seen them, and you've seen them, and you probably don't know that they're Herman's images, right? They're these black and white. And he did this remarkable thing that I think was a very early innovation, which is in live circumstances, he would often shoot as if it was studio photography. So he would have strobes mounted. So sometimes these moments that are actual spontaneous moments actually are lit in a way that almost look like they were staged. And it's kind of this beautiful intersection of artifice and spontaneity and documentary. And anyway, it's kind of a cool technique. And he was doing this back in the 50s. So he was a much older guy. And he was a friend of David Milch's. And I think, his career had had some ups and downs. I think that those negatives of all of that jazz work were forgotten for almost 30 years or so. It was in the mid 80s that somebody rediscovered Herman's archive and tried to help him get it back out in the world and got him some recognition and started printing and selling the work. So this guy, Herman Leonard, it's later in his life. David Milch did him a solid and had him be the set photographer of Deadwood. That was like a gig he threw him, which was kind of cool. So I met David through Judd. One day Judd said, "Come with me. I'm going to meet David Milch." He's kind of a mentor of Judd's. Judd goes and takes him out to lunch every once in a while. And I went with them. And I mean, first of all, just meeting David Milch was so thrilling. He's also totally like a preacher, lunatic, crazy person, you know, like he lies on the floor because he has back issues, and around him is paper everywhere. And what he does is he records himself inhabiting the characters, and then he has an army of interns transcribe all of that shit, and then he assembles the stories. So he's like, it's like part seance, part writing session, you know what I mean? And just to be in his space and see that was incredible. And he's also quoting poets off the top of his head, and it was just very heady stuff. And by the end of that meeting, he said to me, "I want you to make a documentary about Herman Leonard. I think we should do that." And another thing about David Milch that was sort of, this is, at the time I was just so flabbergasted by, but he notoriously was, money in his hands was very, sort of slippery. Like he was often like, I remember when I left that day, he tried to hand me $100. Like he would give out money, and money, he had a weird relationship with money and gambling and power. I mean, I think he was an addict in many forms, and gambling was ultimately one of those things. And he squandered this massive fortune that he had accomplished or accumulated. But got him all over the place. But basically, Milch said, "Let's make a Herman Leonard doc." And I said, "Great." And he immediately gave me $20,000. And I was like, amazing. And of course, that's like, not enough to necessarily make a film, but I knew that I could do some shooting with that and, get a DP and go out and start shooting. So we spent a bunch of time with uh, Herman Leonard. And what became clear is that Herman was actually pretty sapped of energy. He had cancer. He was in a bit of a diminished state. He couldn't shoot with us for very long. But lo and behold, we shot a gallery opening and we did a bunch of interviews. Um, and then there came this moment where it was clear that Herman's health had declined to such a point that we really couldn't shoot anymore, and Herman died. And I felt terrible that we didn't have enough material for a documentary. It just sort of plagued me. And I went back to David Milch and I was like, we shot. I mean, I guess, am I giving away a flip side spoiler alert here? I
I
mean,
don't
it
know.
doesn't
It's
matter.
okay.
Who
I do it
fucking
all the
cares?
time in
Yeah.
interviews. It's not going to
It
stop
doesn't
people.
matter. It's not like anyone. Yeah, it's not like it's White Lotus or something.
I look
So
at it as a teaser because, yeah.
I'll just say that I went back to David Milch and I said, I'm very sorry, but I don't think we have enough to make a film. And he sort of looked at me and he was like, I didn't think you were going to make a film. And he basically made clear that he just wanted to lavish Herman with the attention of a documentary crew in the last couple weeks of his life as this act of like generosity and attention and sort of affirmation of his career. And it was like this wild performance art piece that I didn't even know I had been cast into, that I was participating in, where I was like the documentary filmmaker fake filming Herman Leonard on behalf of David Milch. Like it was totally insane.
But it seemed to work for Herman because what I find so interesting about him as an artist that it took him so long to see the value in his own work, you know? Here he is, an old man kind of contemplating work he'd done decades earlier. And in my experience, great artists usually, you know, don't lack self-confidence. You know what I mean? I've got like, you know, maybe there's a lot of self-loathing going on, but they don't usually lack self-confidence. And for me, it was, if they do, they find a way to circumnavigate it. It made me, it makes me sad that Herman never got to see Flipside in a way, because I kind of see a sort of moment of recognition that like, yeah, I mean, you know, I really did
I will
create
say,
something lasting, and that doesn't happen without David Milch putting you up to this charade.
I will say, I don't wanna make Herman seem like he was totally obscure. Like his work has been acquired by museums and, his prints sell and you can buy them online. And the one thing he was doing at the end of his life, which I think he was quite proud of, was like the definitive monograph of all the work. So work from when he was younger, the jazz work, other things he'd done after the jazz work. Um, so I actually think that, Herman did get some recognition. I would have loved for him to have seen it. Another peril of this Flipside project was that so that footage sat for, again, another 8, 9, 10 years unused. And then when I assembled it and we started putting it into Flipside the film, I realized that I had to go back to his estate, which is basically his daughter, and say, "Will you let me use this?" And that's what's gnarly also about letting things, languish a little bit. On these unfinished projects, I had to return to each person and get their permission. And they had changed, circumstances had changed. And it was very tricky to navigate, like getting the permission for all these people to participate in the film. So that was just a funny little documentary footnote of the peril of waiting that long to finish things.
Well, I mean, the struggle paid off because you don't feel it at all. The film feels so organic. It feels like you set out to make it the way you did. And I understand as an artist who deals a narrative how hard it is to tie divergent things into things, to get those themes to all gel from these different people. One
Are you are
person,
you a are you a like a note card guy? Are you like a what's your structuring device for all this
it's
writing?
pretty crazy. It used to be what I do is I get this like 2 by 3 paper board, the thick poster board, and I would put like 20 all over my ping pong table, on my pool table, on my shuffleboard table. I cover every surface and I'd have like 20 different colors of Sharpie pens. And I would just kind of go about almost in a trance. It was like half sort of trance, but half sort of like alcohol fueled. And I would just pick up a color, and each one of these things became like a container.
Yeah.
And I didn't even really know what I was doing. I didn't know what purple meant, but like purple was just a line of thinking. And each one of these things would become a bucket. Like this was characters over here. This was themes over here. This was like set pieces. Maybe I didn't know what to get that, but I was attached to. This was just sheer continuity stuff. Like when people are born, because that stuff becomes like, continuity can become a nightmare, as I'm sure you understand. And and I would just keep switching pens, and eventually I would start to see what each color kind of meant, and eventually what would happen is, like, this sheet would become joined with that sheet, and the buckets would get smaller and smaller, and eventually I would just have one sheet, and it almost looked like almost an outline, not like a beat for beat, "This is what's gonna happen," but a beat for beat, "This is what I need to happen." This is sort of the dramatic structure of the thing. Anyway, enough about me. They have to hear about this all the time. But this is a good time to talk about Starlee Kine. Who's kind of a frustrated writer who gets this contract to write this nonfiction book. She's really talented, really funny,
Yeah.
clearly a great writer, but she struggles with productivity on the page when she has the contract. And there's a certain type of personality, I think, that seems to want to occupy the space of an artist at some point, or they approach it that way, like, I'm going to be a writer, but they just have problems actually doing the work. They think that they think that the big struggle is just like finding the impetus, you know what I mean? Or figuring it out. But like the real struggle, as you and I know, is like whatever, wading through the 80 hours that you
Yeah.
shot and looking for a thread, or actually just writing all
The
that
doing, yeah.
exposition and trying to, do and so I coach people like this, that like many of them, or mentor them, that are like, I want to do. And did she ever get started? I know no spoilers. I won't tell you what
No,
happens
no,
in
no.
the book, but
I don't think
I
I
want to
was
know,
joking
is
about
Starly
spoilers.
still riding? Is she overcome? Because I very much feel for her. I feel for this because I don't deal with writer's block, right? I'm always good working on 3 novels. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a myth. People work in different ways, but for me, I can't afford to, like both financially and mentally,
No, no,
afford to
no.
be
I hear you.
blocked. So I'm always working on one thing where I'm composing, one thing where I may be researching, and one thing where I'm line editing. So there's always work to do.
Yeah.
And so, like, what I try to teach these people is when you start doing the work, that's when the magic happens. You just
Yeah.
stumble into accidents, or you stumble into inspiration. You can't just sit there wringing your hand thinking about it. You
Yeah.
actually have to physically pick up the camera or
Yeah.
get
That
to the
was a big thing that David Milch was all about, and he says in Flipside, which is forget what you think of yourself as your identity as a writer. It's
Yes.
all located in the writing itself. It has nothing to do with talking about writing or telling other people you're a writer. It is what is happening when you are actually doing the act of writing. It
Yeah,
all
and
kind of,
getting out of your own way, right?
yeah.
Like giving yourself to the thing itself because it's bigger than you. You're the
Yeah.
vehicle for it.
So just to fill out the Starly story, this woman writing this book, and it was going to be about the sort of folly of the self-help industry, how absurd it had gotten, and a lot of these techniques that seem sort of dubious. And I think, hey, wait a minute, I've never seen this done. Let's do a documentary about the writing of a book where I will follow her through the blank page to the finished thing, and we will go into these weird world of self-help, and I will photograph her going to these seminars and sessions and writing. And what becomes clear at a certain point is that she gets completely blocked and she can't follow through. She's just paralyzed, and I totally identify with this because I have had that as well. This is another form of creative failures, when you are in your own way, when you're in your head, where you can't get over the obstacles, when the blank page makes you nauseous and you literally would like to do anything else other than engage with it. So I started shooting with her, and you know, I think she had a lot of interesting things to. It was an interesting moment to catch her in, because she was feeling so, you know, humiliated almost by not being able to finish this. And I felt like that ended up, so she doesn't write that book. And of course, then there's no documentary as a result. So I have another unfinished project on my shelf.
One on Herman, one on
Yeah.
Starly,
So
if you're
this
keeping
becomes now
track.
another chapter of Flipside, is another unfinished project. To your other question, Starly, I think, like many, has had massive creative ups and downs. She had this absolutely amazing podcast called Mystery Show during the sort of peak of the podcast era. It was on Gimlet, and it was incredible. And it was, each week she would solve a mystery. It was brilliant storytelling. Um, and it was successful. It did well. I think she even appeared on Fallon or Colbert or something. You know what I mean? Like, she had a great moment with that. But then, like, there was some drama behind the scenes, and the show got dropped. She went on, she wrote for TV. I think that was great for a while, but that whole economy is crashing and shrinking. And I think she is, like a lot of us, is really trying to figure out how to continue to make a living doing creative work in this batshit crazy shrinking economy, this, pre-AI kind of, you know, where all this content has been so profoundly devalued. So Starly, I think, is still fighting the good fight, but I think she's struggling like the rest of us. And she's definitely had some moments of great success. She by no means, languished, and that was not the last thing she did. But I text with her every once in a while. And there was this New York Times article recently about kind of, Gen X, their work lives, all of us embarking on these careers like in publishing or magazine writing or, filmmaking, that are becoming obsolete. And it was kind of a really interesting reflection on that. And she texted me immediately after and was like, "Oh my God, this speaks to me and destroyed my life reading this." You know what I mean? So she's out there, but she's still on the grind, the freelance grind.
So I mean, like, I'm working on novel 10 in my book. I mean, I'm out on submission right now, like not under contract for the first time in 10 years or something, and it's terrifying because like everyone's like, yeah, well, fiction's just not selling, and that's it. It doesn't matter who's fiction. They're just like, oh, people don't want to read about this. It's yeah, it's terrifying, and I think that I don't know. You did a beautiful job of tying all these stories together. I'm going to be really pushing the film. I've already told a million people
I
about it.
really appreciate it.
He is Chris Wilcha. The film is Flip Side. You can find it on Amazon, but stream it somewhere else. We already had that discussion, but
It's
that's
on,
where I
it's on,
found
right
it.
now.
Had I known.
It's on Criterion. You can see it on Amazon or Apple, and then also if you happen to be flying Delta anytime in the next couple weeks, you can see it on a flight.
I cannot recommend it. Like, listen, I start so many movies and shows, and I just give up. And it's the first thing I've watched in months that I was just like, I just love this. So, I urge you to go out and watch it. I promise you'll be rewarded. It's a wonderful, thoughtful, lovingly directed film, and easily my
Thank you.
favorite of the year. Chris,
I
thank you
appreciate
for
it.
being our fresh face in hell.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that word of mouth is everything. That's all I have at this point. Like, there's no lavish marketing budget. So this is very meaningful to use your platform and your audience to tell about Flipside. And thank you for telling friends. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. A Fresh Face in Hell with Jonathan Evison is brought to you by Fresh Face Pods and produced by Jason Botkin and yours truly. Check us out on Instagram, YouTube, or at our website at freshfacepods.tv. Don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for updates and special content. And if you love the podcast, by all means, run out and buy all of Jonathan Evison's award-winning novels wherever books are sold.